Marcus Webb, the one who had already earned a notation in Velcranthos' mental files by virtue of existing, sat in the third row. He had dark eyes, a still expression, and he was watching the holographic display above the lecture stage with a politely detached air of someone waiting for a conversation to get interesting. During Velcranthos' award-winning lecture on Krillian acid spitters, a presentation that had earned him the prestigious Xanthra Prize for Xenobiological Excellence, a lecture that had made grown academics weep with appreciation, Marcus Webb crossed his arms and looked bored. Bored. During the Xanthrop-winning lecture, Velcranthos felt something shift in the architecture of his pride. It was not quite anger. It was sharper than that. It was a particular, electric indignation of a performer who has encountered a member of the audience reading a different book. He made a decision on the spot. There in the shimmering blue spotlight of his own certainty, his next lecture series would focus entirely on humans. He would disassemble their laughable biology piece by piece. He would expose the fragile, improbable, thoroughly undeserved existence of the dominant species of Earth. He would demonstrate, with scientific precision and perhaps a touch of theatrical flair, exactly why Homo sapiens should have gone extinct approximately 4 million times before achieving spaceflight. He smiled to himself as he wrapped up the lecture, his teeth catching the light. This was going to be his masterpiece. He began preparations that very night. Bolab 7 was not Velcranthos' usual stage. Lecture Hall Via 9 was comfortable, familiar, acoustically perfect, and designed for performance. Bolab 7 was something different, a Level 3 biological research lab with containment fields layered like geological strata, chemical fume extractors rated for atmospheric emergencies, redundant power couplings, and enough emergency override switches to make a safety inspector weep with gratitude. It was where the Institute kept things that needed keeping carefully. Velcranthos had chosen it for its gravitas. A lecture on human biological failure deserved a proper arena. He had gone to extraordinary lengths for the occasion. The holographic displays were triple resolution, their projectors positioned to render every cellular detail in luminous clarity. The specimen containers were arranged on the central analysis platform in ascending order of what he'd labeled, in his preparatory notes, evolutionary embarrassment. The lighting had been redesigned. Dramatic shadows, precision spotlights aligned to catch each display at the exact moment of maximum theatrical impact. He had even commissioned a short musical flourish, for synthesized notes of descending irony, to punctuate his major revelations. This was not merely a lecture. This was theater. This was art. This was going to be the defining moment of a career already defined by defining moments. He had sourced his specimens through channels his research assistant had repeatedly and nervously described as legally ambiguous. Earth organisms for demonstration purposes, bacterial cultures from common soil samples, a single invasive vine species, a sealed collection of what the vendor had called assorted earth insects, harmless, educational. He had assured himself at every step that these were simple, primitive things, organisms from a world barely past the Bronze Age in galactic terms, species that existed on a planet most advanced civilizations used as a reference point for what biology looked like before it figured out what it was doing. Trill had read every warning label on every container. She had tried to show them to Velcranthos. He had waved her off with the benevolent impatience of a scholar who had moved beyond such pedestrian concerns. The students filed into Bolab 7 precisely on schedule, 73 being from 4 to 2 species, filling the tiered observation benches in a wash of color, form, and species-specific nervous energy. A cat-hairy delegation of 4 occupied the front row, their segmented bodies oriented forward with the attentive precision of predator-class intelligences. A pair of Vine students settled into the elevated rear section, their bioluminescent patterns shifting in something that read as anticipation. Gurnneck, a student who had never been observed displaying any emotion more pronounced than mild interest, whose home planet was famous for producing predators that hunted by burrowing through solid rock, took a seat near the aisle and arranged their considerable bulk with deliberate calm. Velcranthos spotted the 3 humans in the third row. Marcus Webb sat slightly forward in his chair, his arms loose at his sides, his forward-facing eyes scanning the specimen containers on the analysis platform with an expression that Velcranthos could not quite categorize. Not fear, not awe, something quieter and more attentive than either. Rita Torres had produced a small notebook, paper, actual physical paper, which was either charming or alarming depending on one's perspective, and was making preliminary notes. Jack Chen was watching the emergency override panels near the exit with a calm, professional interest of someone who liked knowing where the exits were. Velcranthos filed this away as charming. It was not charming. He spread his arms wide, his lab coat flaring behind him like a ceremonial cape. Several students in the front row flinched instinctively. He took this as the appropriate response. "Welcome," he announced, his three voices filling the room with practiced resonance. "Today we examine one of the galaxy's most enduring mysteries. How, against every principle of biological probability, did humans survive long enough to achieve spaceflight?" The laughter that rippled through the room was immediate and gratifying. The cat-hairy delegation clicked their mandibles in synchronized appreciation. The Vine twins in the back row puffed their cheek sacs. Even Gurneck, who had never once laughed at anything, produced a low whistle of what could charitably be interpreted as approval. Marcus Webb uncrossed his legs and crossed his arms instead. His expression did not change. "Interesting," Velcranthos noted, with a detached interest of a researcher observing a curious specimen. "Fascinating, actually." He pressed forward, tapping his data slate, and the first hologram materialized above the platform, a rotating three-dimensional diagram of the human skeleton, every bone rendered in luminous detail. "Behold," he said, his tone the particular register of a man who has been waiting to say behold for some time, "the internal framework of Homo sapiens. I draw your attention first to the locomotion architecture. 2 legs." He let the number hang in the air. Not 4, not 6, not even a stabilizing posterior appendage for balance correction. Just 2. 2 spindly limbs balanced on platforms they call feet, each containing 26 individual bones. He zoomed the display into the foot structure, the arch of tiny bone filling the hologram in loving, damning detail. The human body contains 300 bones in total. 26 of them, nearly 9% of their entire skeletal allocation, are dedicated to these terminal appendages. That is not anatomy. That is engineering comedy. The laughter deepened. A Boresian in the front row slapped his bench with enough force to leave a dent. "But the foot," Velcranthos continued, pacing now with the energy of a creature who knew they had an audience, "is merely the opening act." He swept the diagram aside and produced a new one. The human cardiovascular system, pulsing in red and blue, its single central organ beating in slow, visible rhythm. One heart, a single fist-sized muscle upon which their entire circulatory system depends. A cat Harry, he nodded to the front row, possesses 3 hearts in distributed positions throughout their thoracic cavity. A standard aim configuration runs 5, network for redundancy. The human design places every circulatory egg in one biological basket, and then asks that basket to keep beating for 100 years without maintenance. He shook his head with theatrical sorrow. If it stops, not if it's destroyed, merely if it stops, the organism has approximately 4 minutes before catastrophic, irreversible system failure. 4 minutes. That is not a survival mechanism. That is a countdown timer with biological pretensions. A Kale student in the middle row raised one claw-tipped limb. "Professor, surely they must have some adaptive advantages. Something that compensated." "Oh," Velcranthos said, his tone warming with the genuine pleasure of someone who has been handed the exact setup they wanted. "They do. They have hair." He brought up a close-range scan of human skin, the fine follicles visible as delicate strands in the holographic light. Thin protein filaments distributed across their body surface. They provide essentially zero protection from impact, temperature extremes, radiation, or predation. Their functional purpose is, at best, decorative. He paused for the beat that 11 years of lecture performance had taught him was a correct length. They also sweat. He let the word sit there, weighted with all the professional disdain it deserved. When their internal temperature rises, their skin, their primary external organ, the membrane keeping their fluids from simply flowing out onto the floor, begins actively releasing those fluids. Through pores. Voluntarily. Their primary thermoregulation strategy is controlled fluid loss. He spread his hands in a gesture of cosmic bafflement. They are, in the technical biological sense, self-basting. The room erupted. Even the usually inscrutable Gurneck made a sound. Velcranthos glanced at Marcus. The human had not reacted. He was still sitting with his arms folded, his expression that same unreadable quiet, not defensive, not amused, just waiting, as though he had arrived knowing how the story ended and had simply settled in to watch the journey. A small, precise feeling moved through Velcranthos' awareness. He did not name it. He shelved it. He had a lecture to deliver. But enough theory, he announced, turning to the specimen containers arranged on the analysis platform behind him. Let me show you the organisms that humans share their death world with, the competition they face, the threats that shape them, or rather, given their current biological state, fail to adequately do so. He approached the first container, a sealed cylinder housing a simple petri dish, clearly labeled in his own handwriting as earth bacteria, Bacillus subtilis, soil sample, harmless. He picked it up and held it toward the light. This, he announced, is what humans encounter billions of times every single day. A soil bacterium so basic, so structurally unremarkable, that it has existed virtually unchanged for approximately 3.5 billion years. It predates complex multicellular life. It predates the oceans in their current form. It is, evolutionarily speaking, a draft that nature never bothered to revise. He set the dish on the analysis platform. And yet, the human immune system treats exposure to it as a significant threat requiring active intervention, a process they call antibiotics, chemical agents administered simply to survive contact with date. Imagine, he said softly, with the reverence of someone describing genuine tragedy, being that fragile. 12 years of laboratory training murmured something in the architecture of his judgment. Check the seals. Verify atmospheric compatibility. Review the handling protocol. His ego was louder. It usually was. He pressed a containment release. The cylinder hissed open. The petri dish sat on the platform, looking precisely as threatening as a cup of warm tea, a thin, slightly murky film of beige culture in clear nutrient gel. The air carried the faintest organic scent, earthy and mild. Marcus Webb uncrossed his arms and leaned slightly forward. Velcranthos held up the dish and let the spotlights catch it from multiple angles. This, he said, is what passes a biological hazard on Earth. The holographic scanner hummed to life, projecting a magnified image of the culture above the platform. Tiny rod-shaped organisms moved in the gel, their simple forms cycling through their ancient metabolic routines, utterly indifferent to everything happening around them. Note the cellular architecture, Velcranthos continued. No complex organelles, no sophisticated defense adaptations, no offensive chemistry of any consequence. Just basic cellular reproduction and metabolic function, repeated indefinitely. He gestured at the image with a kind of fond contempt. A first-year biology student could produce something more impressive as a term project. The fact that humans require medical intervention simply to coexist with this is not a testament to the bacterium's danger. It's a testament to human. The environmental sensor beeped. A single soft pulse, the kind of readout fluctuation that labs produce a dozen times a day. Velcranthos glanced at the display. Atmospheric composition, minor variation. The bacteria were producing waste gases at a slightly elevated rate. He frowned slightly, then decided it was a routine metabolic response to the lab's particular atmospheric blend, 80% nitrogen, 18% oxygen, 2% trace elements, and returned his attention to the lecture. The sensor beeped again, and then it stopped beeping in pulses and began beeping continuously. On the holographic display, the bacterial colony was visibly changing. The thin beige film was thickening, its edges spreading in real time across the surface of the gel. Velcranthos tracked the display with a frown that was still academic, still confident, still wearing the comfortable mask of expertise. Bacterial reproduction under optimal conditions, he said. Entirely expected. Textbook behavior. 1 cell becomes 2, 2 becomes 4. Professor, said a student in the second row, a young Boresian with all 4 arms raised slightly in the universal posture of I'm worried about this. Is it supposed to be happening that fast? It was not. He knew it was not. The doubling time was dropping from minutes to seconds, which was not how terrestrial bacteria behaved under controlled conditions. This was not textbook behavior. This was something else. The petri dish had gone from beige to murky brown. The culture was visibly denser, visibly growing. in a way that made the holographic magnification look less like a biology demonstration and more like a time-lapse of something that had decided it very much wanted to be somewhere else. Then came the smell. Earthy at first, then richer, then something sharper underneath, something organic and prescient and alive in a way that made the fine sensory receptors along Velcranthos' neck ridge transmit a signal that older, less credentialed parts of his brain translated simply as wrong. "Professor!" Trill's voice had gone flat. Not the flat of boredom, the flat of professional alarm carefully managing itself. She was at her monitoring console, both of her upper arms working rapidly. The bacterial mass is producing acidic compounds. She stopped. It's dissolving the dish. The holographic display confirmed it before he could formulate a dismissal. Hairline fractures were spreading across the petri dish from multiple points simultaneously, thin as spider silk, multiplying with the patient. Unhurried efficiency of something that had no concept of urgency because urgency was for organisms that thought they might run out of time. Velcranthos lunged for the emergency containment panel and slammed his palm down. A secondary force field snapped into place around the entire analysis platform with a sound like a thunderclap, humming with enough channeled energy to stop a plasma burst. The bacterial spread hit the field boundary and stopped. The relief was immediate and substantial. "Contained," Velcranthos announced, straightening his lab coat and attempting to recover the authority that had briefly left the building. "Completely under control. What we just witnessed is a demonstration of Earth organisms' fundamental survival strategy, quantity over quality, aggressive reproduction as a substitute for sophistication, volume in lieu of." He noticed that approximately a third of the students had moved toward the exits. He also noticed that the cat-hairy delegation had extended their secondary defensive spines, which they only did when their deep instinctual systems had processed something as a threat regardless of what their rational minds had decided. He noticed that Marcus Webb had leaned back in his chair and recrossed his arms. And he couldn't not notice, that the expression on the human's face had shifted very slightly. The waiting quality remained, but now there was something else in it. Something quiet and almost warm, like the expression of someone watching a story they know will reach the part where it starts to get interesting. "Moving on," Velcranthos said, his voice a half-note higher than intended. He cleared his throat. "Earth's plant life. Even more primitive. Even less impressive." He activated the second specimen container. The second container held a small terracotta pot, unremarkable in every respect. From the pot grew a vine, green, broadleaf, modest in the way that things are modest when they are waiting for an opportunity. It had been listed in his procurement documents as Pueraria montana lobetta, common name Kudzu, vendor description, invasive vine species, used in erosion control, completely harmless. The last two words had been the deciding factor in his purchase. Earth vegetation, Velcranthos announced, recovering his cadence, operates on one of the most inefficient energy conversion systems in recorded xenobotany. Photosynthesis, the capture of light energy and a conversion into chemical compounds, achieves, in this species, roughly 6% efficiency under optimal conditions. He brought up a comparison chart. The xanthrope sun feeders of the cooperative's northern territories achieve 40%. Earth plants achieve 6%. On a good day, with adequate water. He let the comparison hover in the air above the platform. It is not merely inefficient. It's embarrassing. He adjusted the overhead lighting array, increasing intensity to approximately 3 times normal. "I'll demonstrate the plant's response to enhanced light exposure. Minimal uptick, negligible growth. The organic equivalent of a shrug." The Kudzu did not shrug. The Kudzu noticed. Within 30 seconds of the light increase, a single tendril at the vine's outermost edge curled. Not dramatically, just a slow, deliberate arc, the way a hand curls when something interesting comes within reach. Then another tendril. Then the broad leaves rotated on their stems with a smooth, tracking precision that Velcranthos registered as phototropic response, and his instincts registered as something with intent. Programmed behavior, he said quickly, entirely predictable. The plant is simply. The vine grew 3 centimeters in 10 seconds. The room went quiet. Velcranthos stared at the readout, then at the plant, then at the readout again. 3 centimeters in 10 seconds was not plant growth. Plant growth was measured in days, in weeks, in seasonal increments that required months of observation to confirm. This was not plant growth. This was a vine doing something that plants, by definition, did not do. That's not. He checked the data twice, looked for instrument error, found none. The metabolic rate is. It's drawing water, Trill said quietly from her console. The water uptake is off the charts. It's consuming nutrients like an active animal. The roots are, she paused. The roots are expanding into the soil matrix at approximately 10 times normal rate. Professor, I don't think. A tendril slipped over the pot's rim and began moving across the analysis platform, not creeping, not drifting, moving with a slow, inexorable directness, the way water moves downhill, not because it has chosen path, but because it has simply identified the direction that everything leads. Also contained, Velcranthos said, and slammed another field into place. The vine pressed against the energy barrier like a child pressing against glass to see what was on the other side. It pushed with gentle, steady, increasing force. The field's power reading began to drop. Slowly, steadily, 1 decimal point at a time. Sweat was forming along Velcranthos' neck scales. He had not, until this moment, known that his species was capable of sweating. He found this deeply ironic. Science, he announced to the room, with diminishing conviction, is about controlled observation. We are observing. Things are controlled. He gestured broadly. Both of these things are true. Then the third container began to rattle. It was subtle at first, a slight vibration, the kind of sound container makes when something inside it shifts position. Then more insistent. Then the rattle of something testing the walls, not frantically, but methodically, the way you check a door before deciding whether to knock or simply open it. 73 students turned to look at the container simultaneously. Marcus Webb had not moved from his chair, but he was smiling now, not broadly, not with cruelty or mockery, but with a quiet, private smile of someone who has read the last page of a book before beginning it and is watching the story arrive at what they already know is coming. The container was labeled, in Velcranthos' own handwriting, Earth Insects, Assorted, Educational. Harmless, his survival instincts, which had been educated out at him through 17 degrees and 4 decades of academic confidence, screamed at him from somewhere beneath all that learning. Stop, step back, evacuate, take up theoretical mathematics, where the worst thing that can happen is an elegant proof turns out to be wrong. His ego had other plans. He opened the third container. They did not burst out. They emerged, 1 at first, then 3, then a dozen, cockroaches leading the advance, their reddish-brown bodies catching the spotlight in a way that made them look less like insects and more like very small, very confident armored vehicles. Behind them came ants in careful single file, and a beetle of such solid, methodical presence that Velcranthos found himself involuntarily thinking of it as a person. Harmless, he said, watching them spread across the platform surface. Earth insects are small, structurally fragile by any galactic standard, and completely lacking in the sophisticated hive communication systems of proper cooperative species. They operate on pure instinct, scattered and uncoordinated. Watch how they... The ants were not scattered. They were moving in organized columns, forming a geometric pattern across the platform that any military mind would have recognized as a reconnaissance grid. The cockroaches were distributing themselves to the edges of the containment field and pressing against it at irregular intervals, not randomly, but at intervals that corresponded precisely to the field's junction points, the microscopic gaps where the energy curtain met the platform's physical infrastructure. The beetle had not moved at all. It sat in the center of the platform and watched Velcranthos with its compound eyes, and if he was projecting sentience onto a creature with a brain the size of a grain of rice, he felt entirely entitled to do so, because it was looking at him the way a structural engineer looks at a building that has been constructed without regard for its own foundation. Professor... Trill's voice had achieved a new quality, the specific flatness of professional calm that is 3 seconds away from professional abandon. She was pointing at 4 different things simultaneously with her 4 arms. The bacterial containment is failing. The kudzu is entering secondary growth phase. The insects are, they're organizing. She pointed upward. And something is growing in the ventilation system. Velcranthos looked up. The ventilation grill above the bacterial containment field had, at some point in the preceding minutes, acquired a coating of green, fuzzy, textured green, spreading from the grill's edges across the ceiling tiles in a slow, patient bloom. Mold, earth mold, in his sealed laboratory ventilation system. When, he thought, with the stunned quality of someone who has found evidence of a crime they cannot explain, did that happen? Marcus could have told him, immediately, the moment the bacterial dish had been opened, the moment organic earth material had been introduced into an atmospheric environment it had never encountered, the opportunistic microfungi in the sample had done what 4 billion years of selection had optimized them to do. They had found the air current. They had followed it. They had begun colonizing the damp, nutrient-adjacent surface of the ventilation infrastructure with the cheerful aggression of organisms that had survived ice ages, continental collisions, and asteroid winters by being exactly this kind of relentlessly, joyfully opportunistic. Activate full atmospheric filtration, Velcranthos commanded, jabbing at his console. Maximum filtration, all systems. The A scrubbers activated with a roar. The mold stopped spreading for approximately 5 seconds. Then it changed color. It had been green. Now it was cycling through brown toward a deep, unsettling orange, and the atmospheric sensors began recording the production of chemical compounds that the monitoring system flagged with increasing urgency as it worked through its own database, found no match, and invented new categories. The sensors stopped beeping in measured intervals. They began screaming. Carbon dioxide, rising. Oxygen, fluctuating. Unknown organic compounds, detected in 17 distinct molecular structures. Temperature, climbing. Humidity, spiking to the dew point. The kudzu chose its precise moment to release pollen. Not flowers, a cloud of microscopic yellow particles that drifted from the vine's leaves in a gentle, beautiful, catastrophic haze. It passed through the energy containment field with complete indifference because the containment field had been calibrated to stop matter at the cellular level and pollen grains were subcellular. No one in the lab had been consulted on this distinction. The kudzu certainly hadn't. The cloud spread through the air. A vine student in the 3rd row sneezed, a single, violent convulsion that turned 6 heads. Then another sneeze. Then the cat-hairy delegation in the front row began clicking in distress. Their respiratory filters, designed for the specific atmospheric chemistry of their home world, rated for dozens of known galactic irritants, completely overwhelmed by something that billions of years of plant evolution on a high-competition death world had optimized to be exactly as pervasive and adhesive as possible. Remain calm, Velcranthos said, his voice now definitively in a higher register than he wanted. This is a minor atmospheric event. The filtration systems will. The filtration systems were not handling it. The filtration systems had been designed for galactic standard atmospheric contamination, which operated according to predictable chemical principles. Earth pollen did not operate according to predictable chemical principles. It operated according to the principle of I will land on every available surface, and I will not be removed by anything short of a nuclear event, and even then we'll see. The ants found the gap. It was microscopic, a point where the containment field's lower edge met the platform's power coupling conduit, a junction too small to be visible, calibrated to stop matter above a certain threshold. The ants were below that threshold. They filed through in perfect single file, carrying fragments of the bacterial culture with them. Because of course they did. They were already leaving. They might as well bring resources. Velcranthos lunged toward the platform. An ant climbed onto his extended finger. He looked at it. It looked back at him in a way that ants look at things, with the entire focused attention of an organism that has survived 100 million years by paying extremely close attention to opportunities. It bit him. It was barely a pressure, a pinprick, an insult more than an injury, but it was the most personally affronted Velcranthos had felt in his entire academic career, because he was a tenured professor with 17 degrees in a Xanthroprize, and a creature with a nervous system smaller than his thumbnail had just bitten him. He shrieked. The ant held on. He flailed. The ant held on with the grip strength of an organism whose species had spent 100 million years perfecting the art of not letting go. He managed, after considerable undignified effort, to dislodge it, and the ant calmly rejoined its column and continued about its business. The cockroaches had found the ventilation intake. They went in without hesitation. Seal the ventilation. Velcranthos shouted. Emergency lockdown. Seal everything. Seal all of it. Trill hit the emergency lockdown button with a forearm strike that meant business. Blast doors descended over the lab's main exits with a heavy mechanical finality. The ventilation system cut out with a groan. The lights flickered. In the sudden, relative silence, broken only by the ambient hum of failing equipment, the soft crackling of containment fields under pressure, and the increasingly alarmed sounds of 73 students reconsidering their academic commitments, everyone heard the sound coming from the Kudzu's containment field. A deep, rhythmic creaking. The vine had grown. In the minutes since Velcranthos had last looked at it directly, it had grown to the thickness of his wrist, coiled against the energy barrier in tight spirals, pressing outward with steady, patient, completely unreasonable force. The field's power readout was dropping at 1% per second. 9 to 4, 9 to 3, 9 to 2. How is it doing that? Velcranthos whispered. Energy fields don't fail from plant pressure. That is not how physics works. Professor. Marcus's voice was clear and calm, cutting through the chaos with the precision of a scalpel. He was on his feet now, hands open and extended in a gesture of easy calm. You should step back from the specimens. Velcranthos spun on him, and every frustration of the past hour compressed into a single, incandescent response. This is your planet's fault. Your biology is broken. It doesn't follow rules. None of this should be possible. Marcus didn't flinch. He moved in a slow, steady arc toward the sealed exits, where Rita and Jack were already working the emergency door override with the calm efficiency of people who had grown up on a planet where knowing where the exits were was not paranoia but survival mathematics. With respect, Marcus said, Earth organisms aren't broken. They are optimized. Earth is a Class 9 death world. The environment changes constantly. Temperature swings, chemical surges, pH shifts, catastrophic weather. Everything on Earth either adapted to that variability or went extinct. Adaptation isn't a feature. It's the price of admission. Nonsense. Velcranthos stabbed a finger at his data slate. I have studied your planet's biology for 12 years. I have read every published paper, analyzed every recorded sample. I know more about Earth than you. You studied it from a distance, Marcus said, and there was nothing cruel in his voice, just something clear and honest. From behind glass, from safety, from a place where nothing on the page could actually reach you. He pointed at the bacterial containment field, where the culture had completely dissolved its dish and was now forming a thin, continuous biofilm across every surface it could reach, patient and comprehensive and entirely without malice. That bacteria evolved on a world where the ground chemistry changes with the season, and the temperature swings 60 degrees between sunrise and sunset. It learned to process new chemistry or die. Every generation that survived was one that had already solved the problem you thought was a containment field. The Kudzu hit 50%. The vine pulsed. It put on 10 centimeters in a single burst of cellular expansion that would have taken hours, on any world that didn't run on compressed, hyper-competitive biology of a death world where every day of sunlight was a competition and every resource was contested by 10,000 other species. 40%. The plants, Marcus continued, backing steadily toward the door where his classmates were now creating enough of a gap for students to file through, compete with thousands of other species for every gram of light, every drop of water, every molecule of mineral in the soil. Kudzu specifically can grow a foot per day under normal conditions. You gave it a sealed, controlled environment with no competition, concentrated nutrients, unlimited water, and a direct line to a high-intensity light source. He paused for a single beat. You gave it everything a plant ever wanted, and then asked it to sit quietly. 30%. The vine was now as thick as Velcranthos' thigh, and it had developed thorns. Large, curved, purposeful thorns that had not been there 20 minutes ago. He checked his data slate with shaking hands. Some Kudzu varieties did develop thorns under certain stress conditions. His supplier had, evidently, sent him one of those varieties. Wonderful. Just wonderful. And the insects, Marcus said, almost gently now, as though delivering a diagnosis a patient had already intuited. Those things have survived ice ages, mass extinction events, continental extinctions, and every pesticide compound human chemistry has ever invented. A containment field is just a problem they haven't encountered yet. They love new problems. I am a tenured professor. The words came out louder than Velcranthos intended, raw and unpolished in a way that 17 degrees had taught him never to be. I have 17 degrees. I know what I'm doing. Yeah, Marcus said, and there was something almost kind in it, the way a person is kind when they have to tell you something you aren't going to like. That's what they always say right before the lab explodes. Explodes. Velcranthos stared at him. This is a biology lab. There are no explosive materials. Nothing here can. Professor. Trill's voice had achieved a new register entirely, not flat, not alarmed, but the specific vocal quality of someone reading a final diagnosis. She was already at the door, emergency kit in hand. The Kudzu is producing volatile organic compounds at scale. The bacteria are metabolizing everything, including the insulation on the power conduits, and producing methane as a byproduct. The mold has reached its secondary chemical stage and is releasing. She checked her scanner, something the system is classifying as an oxidizing compound. I don't know what that means for the specific atmospheric mixture we currently have in here, but the fire suppression system apparently does, because it just pre-armed itself. 20%. 15. The beetle moved. It had been perfectly still since the container opened, sitting at the center of the analysis platform like a philosophical inquiry made of chitin and patience, and then, with the unhurried certainty of an organism that had simply been waiting for the correct moment, it spread the wing covers it had kept folded along its back, extended a pair of wings that no one in the room had known were there, and flew directly at the weakest junction in the Kudzu's containment field. 10%. 5. The beetle hit the barrier. The field collapsed, and the Kudzu, which had been pressing against a barrier with the accumulated force of a plant that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, exploded outward. Not violently, not destructively, but with the exuberance of something that has been in a very small space for a very long time and has just been given the entire room to grow into. What happened next would be analyzed by 14 separate academic papers over the following 2 years, reconstructed from sensor logs, student testimony, holographic recordings, and the deeply personal account of one thoroughly humbled xenobiologist. The vine moved through the laboratory like a living tide, wrapping around support pillars and light fixtures and equipment racks with the systematic enthusiasm of a species that had spent millennia competing for structural purchase in dense jungle canopy. It found the light panels and oriented every leaf toward them with an efficiency that the university's solar energy department would later cite, in a footnote, as theoretically interesting. The insects dispersed with purpose. The ants established supply lines toward the nutrient feed systems. The cockroaches disappeared into the ventilation infrastructure and were not seen again for 3 days, at which point they were found to have colonized a floor they had no biological business being on. The beetle, having completed its singular contribution to the evening's events, landed on a wall panel and resumed its attitude of philosophical observation. The mold, freed from the air scrubber suppression, released a final cloud of spores in 12 distinct colors that drifted through the lab in something that, if you were in the mood for metaphor, resembled a very small aurora borealis. Purple, orange, a teal that seemed to glow with its own faint inner light. And then the chemistry happened. When earth bacteria byproducts, Kudzu metabolic waste, mold excretions, and the superheated coolant from a ruptured environmental processor were introduced to each other in a sealed atmosphere that was simultaneously too humid, too warm, and too rich in trace organics. The resulting reaction was not, technically, an explosion. Bolab 7 did not detonate. It expressed itself. Every window blew outward in a simultaneous cascade of pressure release. Both primary doors separated cleanly from their frames. The ventilation grates, which had been holding back a compressed mixture of atmospheric gases that Earth biology had spent the previous 4 to 5 minutes enthusiastically producing, shot down the adjacent corridor like flat, rectangular disappointments made of metal and poor planning. The smell that accompanied all of this occupied a sensory register that had no previous label in galactic taxonomy, burnt plastic underpinned with overripe organic matter, a top note of something fruity and chemical that had no business existing in nature, and a base of something earthy and ancient and alive that seemed to say, quietly and without apology, "We were here before your civilization existed. We will be here when it is gone." Velcranthos was already in the corridor when the pressure wave hit him. It knocked him forward onto his face, his scales scraping against the floor, his data slate skittering away into the stampede of fleeing students. He rolled onto his back just in time to watch the contents of Bolab 7 emerge from the lab's destroyed entrance in a slow, inexorable wave. The Kudzu came first. It emerged wrapped around everything it had touched: support struts, cable conduits, a furniture unit that had been bolted to the wall, dragging them with it like trophies as it poured into the corridor and immediately oriented all available leaves toward the overhead light panels with a calm, single-minded focus of plant that has found what it came for. The mold cloud followed, 12 colors, drifting through the air in slow, luminous billows that would have been genuinely beautiful under any other circumstances. Then the foam. No one had anticipated the foam. In retrospect, it was chemically inevitable. The combination of bacterial metabolic byproducts, Kudzu cellular secretions, mold excretions, and the superheated cleaning solution from the lab's emergency wash system had created an expanding compound that was stable, adhesive, and growing. It moved down the corridor like a slow avalanche of consequence, thick and warm, carrying the scent of fresh bread and electrical fire, catching everything in its path with a gentle, inexorable grip. It caught Velcranthos at the ankles, then the knees, then the waist, pulling him down with the patient inevitability of something that had not only no concept of hurry but had, in fact, never needed any. "Help," he called, to no one in particular and everyone in general. "I am a tenured professor. Someone, this is deeply inappropriate." From a safe distance down the corridor, above the foam's reach, Marcus Webb had a communication device out. He was recording. "This," he said quietly, to no one in particular, "is going to get so many views." The emergency response teams arrived in 90 seconds. They were excellent. They were professional. They were rated for Class 7 biological containment, which was, by Galactic classification standards, nearly the highest tier of biological emergency protocol. They took one look at the corridor, consulted their data slates, took a second, longer look at the corridor, and called for backup. "What is a contamination type?" asked the squad leader, Specialist Sill, through her suit's external speakers. "Earth organisms," Trill supplied helpfully from behind a support pillar. "Multiple species. All of them have opinions about where they want to be." Sill's mandibles went still for a moment. "The Class 9 world? I thought those were supposed to be primitive." "We get that a lot," Marcus said, still recording. "The cleanup took 11 hours. By the end of it, Bolab 7 had been condemned for structural reassessment. The Kudzu had established what the university's botanical emergency team described as a concerning degree of structural integration with the building's load-bearing elements. And the mold had colonized approximately 40% of the surrounding ventilation infrastructure in colors that had no precedent in any galactic biological catalog. Velcranthos sat in the corridor covered from neck to ankle in hardening multicolored foam, with kudzu tendrils coiled around one arm and beginning to take root in his lab coat's fabric. An ant colony had claimed his right pocket and was in the process of making structural improvements. He stared at his data slate, which had somehow survived the disaster and was currently displaying, with apparently malicious timing, the 4 to 7 million views his situation had accumulated on the Galactic network in the past 20 minutes. Someone had already auto-tuned his shrieking into a 4-minute remix. It had a bridge. The foam cracked when he breathed. 3 university administrators arrived, assessed the situation with a comprehensive dispo of people calculating very large numbers, and began filling out forms. A medical technician approached with a bioscan unit and a carefully neutral expression. "So," she said, running the scanner with professional efficiency, "this reads 17 distinct bacterial colonies on your integument for types of fungal spores in your respiratory tract, trace organic compounds in your nasal passages, and," she paused, her scanner making a sound it had not been programmed to make, "something appears to be laying eggs in your right-hand pocket." "The ants," Velcranthos said, with a weary acceptance of a being who has exceeded his capacity for surprise. "That's the ants. We'll need to contact a specialist." "Contact whoever you like," he said. "Burn the lab coat. Burn my degrees. Burn my reputation. It's all gone anyway." At the far end of the corridor, past the emergency teams and the news drones and the gathering crowd of faculty members who had absolutely not come out of their offices just to look, he saw Marcus Webb. The human lowered his recording device. His expression was not mocking. It was something simpler and quieter, the recognition of someone who has been seen, finally, clearly and who offers nothing more complicated than acknowledgement. He raised one hand, a small, unceremonious wave. Velcranthos did not wave back. He just sat there in his foam, surrounded by the thriving, industrious, completely indifferent consequences of his own certainty, and watched the emergency teams try to negotiate with Kudzu. The Kudzu was not negotiating. Above him, on the ceiling, the mold had continued its slow and patient work. In the silence of his own exhausted attention, Velcranthos looked up and realized, with a slow and terrible clarity, that the patterns the orange and purple growth had formed across the ceiling tiles were not random. They were not the abstract blooms of unguided chemistry. He squinted. 2 words, perfectly spaced, written in the patient, indifferent hand of 4 billion years of evolution. Adapt or die. He stared at it for a very long time. Mold can't spell, he said, to no one. No one confirmed this. The University Medical Center had, in its 3 centuries of continuous operation, treated plasma burns, dimensional displacement syndrome, gravitational compression injuries, and the incident with a Vine student who had accidentally created a small singularity during what he described as an experiment with fermented study nutrients. It had not previously treated a case where every injury was entirely self-inflicted by being panicking away from completely harmless organisms. The Earth specimens had not harmed Velcranthos. He had dislocated his shoulder running into a doorframe. He had pulled 3 muscles tripping over his own equipment. He had bruised his scales and cracked 2 ribs falling face first into the foam. His injuries were a perfect, clinical portrait of what it looked like when confidence and reality met at high velocity. He lay in his examination bay wrapped in bandages, reading the digital avalanche with a dull fascination of being observing his own natural disaster. 4 to 7 million views. Climbing. 17 journal requests for his incident analysis. 43 interview requests. 1 book offer. What Not to Do, A Survivor's Guide to Earth Organisms, with an advance that under any other circumstances he would have considered embarrassingly small and now considered suspiciously generous. A message from his department head. Despite the catastrophic property damage and the structural reclassification of 3 floors, I will note that the Xenobiology program has received more external attention in the past 8 hours than it has in the previous 6 years. We will discuss this. I have many feelings. A message from the university president. My office. Tomorrow. Bring documentation. Take a decontamination shower first. Take 2. A knock at the examination bay door. He considered pretending to be asleep. He was, in some respects, a coward. He had known this about himself for some time, and had simply categorized it as selective resource allocation. But his pride, that battered, multicolored, foam-encrusted pride, would not let him hide. Come in. Marcus entered carrying 2 containers of steaming fluid. He set one on the bedside table with the unhurried care of someone who had been raised in a culture that expressed concern through practical action. I brought soup, he said. Hospital food is apparently terrible across all known species. Velcranthos stared at the container. Is it from Earth? Keller mineral broth. Your medical record said it was safe for your species. Marcus pulled a chair to the bedside and sat on it backward, resting his arms across the top rail in that easy human posture. He looked at Velcranthos without judgment, without triumph, with a particular quality of attention the professor was only now recognizing as something he had never directed at anyone in his life, genuine curiosity, uncontaminated by the need to already know the answer. The silence stretched. Velcranthos found, to his own surprise, that it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence of 2 beings who had arrived, via very different routes and with vastly unequal dignity, at the same place. You tried to warn me, Velcranthos said finally. The words came out smaller than he'd intended, stripped of the performance he'd spent decades building. Not during the lecture. Before. From the moment you walked in. You knew. I knew how it usually goes, Marcus said. He sipped his own soup, unhurried. Researchers encounter Earth biology under controlled conditions for the first time, and assume conditions are more controlled than they are. Earth organisms have been doing this for 4 billion years. They've seen worse conditions than a university lab. I was arrogant. Yes. I mocked your species in a public forum attended by dozens of sentient beings. Also yes. And then your planet's dirt destroyed my laboratory. Marcus considered this. The dirt was just doing what dirt does. You gave it unusually good circumstances. A pause. Very unusually good. Velcranthos looked at his bandaged arms, at the medical monitors tracking his unremarkable recovery from entirely self-inflicted injuries, at the news feed still cycling through highlights of his magnificent professional humiliation. Someone had added dramatic orchestral music to the foam scene. It worked, unfortunately. The worst part, he said slowly, is not the memes, though the memes are considerable. The worst part is that I have spent 12 years studying death world biology, and I learned more tonight, in 4 to 5 minutes of catastrophic failure, than I have in my entire career. He looked at the ceiling. I was so certain I understood that I stopped actually learning. I was so busy being superior that I forgot to be curious. Marcus nodded, not to be polite, because it was true. Earth organisms aren't primitive. Velcranthos continued, feeling his way through the words like navigating new territory without a map. They are optimized for survival and extreme variability. They adapt because failure means extinction, and they have failed so many times and adapted so many times that adaptation is not a strategy for them. It is their fundamental nature. He paused. They persist because surrender was bred out of them 4 billion years ago by a planet that was actively trying to kill everything on it. Now you're getting it, Marcus said, and the quiet warmth in his expression was the most complicated thing Velcranthos had encountered all day. Your bacteria dissolved reinforced containment materials. Your vine outpaced a power-coupled energy field. Your insects conducted a coordinated tactical assessment of containment architecture they had never encountered. Your mold adapted to active atmospheric filtration in real time, and then used the remaining minutes to write me a message. Velcranthos shook his head slowly. And none of it was attacking me. None of it wanted anything from me personally. It was all just being what it is. Completely, relentlessly, unapologetically what it is. That's the part most people miss, Marcus said. They see Earth biology do something extraordinary and assume it's aggressive. But the bacteria didn't want to destroy your lab. The Kudzu didn't want to take over your building. They just wanted what all living things want: resources, space, continuity. Your lab happened to have those things, and your containment happened to be calibrated for organisms that play by gentler rules. He looked at Velcranthos directly. Earth organisms don't know gentler rules exist. They never needed to learn them, Velcranthos said quietly. No, they didn't. Velcranthos was quiet for a long moment, turning the soup container in his hands. Outside his window, the Xenobiology building wore its kudzu in the fading afternoon light, green and patient and entirely unconcerned with what anyone thought of it. The emergency teams had stopped trying to remove the vine 3 hours ago. They were now measuring it, documenting it, arguing in low voices about what it meant for the building's structural certification. You know what humanity has that most galactic civilizations don't. Velcranthos asked, I'm curious what you think. You don't know that you're supposed to lose. He said it quietly, like something he was still working out as he said it. Most species, when they encounter something stronger or faster or better armored, recognize it as superior and adjust accordingly. That's rational. That's what intelligence does. But he gestured vaguely. You failed to develop exoskeletons, so you built armor. You failed to develop venom, so you invented chemistry. You failed to develop speed, so you built engines. And when your planet tried to kill you, again and again, across 4 billion years, with ice and fire and darkness and biology, you just kept adapting. Not because you were strong, because you were too stubborn to register that you were losing. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, I've never heard it put quite like that. It's the most terrifying thing in the galaxy, Velcranthos said, with a calm certainty of a revelation that has arrived late and is making up for the delay by arriving completely. Not your weapons or your ships or your ability to ride controlled explosions into interstellar space. It's that at the cellular level, at the most fundamental biological level, you are built from organisms that looked at extinction and said, not yet. Your bacteria say it. Your vines say it. Your insects say it. He looked at Marcus. Do you say it? Every human who has ever done anything difficult has said it, Marcus replied. Most of us don't know that's what we're saying. We just call it stubbornness. Call it what you like, Velcranthos said. The rest of the galaxy calls it extraordinary. A knock at the doorframe. The medical technician, returning with a scanner and cautious eyes. So, just a follow-up. The ant colony in the hazmat disposal unit has, She consulted her data slate. Expanded. The facility manager is asking whether to classify them as a resident biological population or containment breach. Ask them to fill out the paperwork for both and see which one the ants prefer, Velcranthos said. The technician blinked, made a note, retreated. Marcus stood, collecting the empty containers, and paused at the doorway, the same posture, almost, as when he'd paused at the edge of Bolab 7 while the world changed behind him. See you in class, Professor. Assuming the university keeps you on. They will, Velcranthos said, with more steadiness than he'd expected to feel. I am tenured, and more importantly, I am now the only xenobiologist in the galaxy who has experienced Earth biology from inside its preferred operational context. He looked up. That has to count for something in the literature. Marcus smiled. The full version this time, not the small knowing one, but something warmer and more complete, a smile that reached the corners of his strange forward-facing eyes. He raised one hand. A small wave. This time, Velcranthos waved back. 3 weeks later, the paper appeared in the Journal of Category 9 Xenobiology under the title Adaptive Optimization in Terrestrial Organisms, a Practical Encounter with Earth Biology and the Failure of Assumptions. The abstract began. This paper presents a first-hand account of what occurs when established xenobiological assumptions encounter Earth organisms without adequate respect for their evolutionary context. The author, despite 17 advanced degrees and an extensive theoretical background, was comprehensively corrected by a petri dish, a vine, a collection of insects, and airborne fungal spores. What follows is an honest accounting of that correction, its causes, and its implications for the field. It was the most downloaded paper in the journal's history within 48 hours of publication. It remained so for 3 years. Velcranthos rewrote his curriculum entirely, as promised, with 3 rounds of peer review, exhaustive safety protocols, and a foreword that read, "Before beginning this course, the student should accept the following. Everything I previously believed about Category 9 death worlds was correct in theory and catastrophically wrong in practice. The organisms of Earth are not primitive. They are not simple. They are not weak. They are the survivors of 4 billion years of conditions that would have ended any other biosphere in the known galaxy, and they carry that survival in every cell. Treat them with the respect that 4 billion years of victory has earned. I speak from experience. I did not survive with my dignity intact." The course became the most oversubscribed in the department. There was a waiting list. He taught it every cycle, without exception, and never once opened a specimen container without reading every warning label 3 times and consulting 2 colleagues and standing there for a full minute asking himself whether this was actually necessary. It usually was. He did it anyway. Bolab 7 was not demolished. After significant debate, the university board voted to reclassify it as the Earth Biology Annex and commission a proper study of the Kudzu building integration, which had turned out to be architecturally interesting in ways no one had anticipated. The vine had distributed its root system through the load-bearing structures in a pattern that improved the building's resistance to seismic stress by 12%. A paper was published on this as well, co-authored by 3 xenobotanists and 1 very surprised structural engineer who could not, in professional conscience, argue with the numbers. The mold remained on the ceiling. Attempts to remove it had been made twice. Both times it returned within 72 hours in slightly different colors, as though it were renovating. Eventually, the university accepted this and redirected the cleaning budget elsewhere. Graduate students who worked late in the annex reported that the ceiling patterns sometimes shifted subtly overnight, new arrangements forming from the old, though no one ever managed to photograph this convincingly enough to publish. The ant colony in the hazmat disposal unit was officially classified as a resident biological population, given the designation Formicity Subcolony 7A, assigned a monitoring budget, and quietly studied by 3 generations of graduate students who found them an inexhaustible source of data on adaptive behavior in novel environments. They thrived. They always had. Marcus, who had finished his exchange semester, earned the highest grade in Velcranthos' revised course, and returned to Earth with a recording of the post-incident conversation that he had never intended to share publicly and never did. Some things, he had decided, were complete as private memories. On his last day at the Institute, he left something on Velcranthos' desk, a small terrarium, sealed, carefully ventilated, labeled in his precise handwriting. Inside it, a cutting of kudzu grew from a handful of dark earth soil, small and green and quiet under the gentle light of the office window. Patient, unhurried, already reaching, just slightly, toward the warmth. The label read, "You should see what it looks like with room to grow." Velcranthos placed it on the windowsill. He watered it every morning. He watched it grow with the attention of someone who has learned, at considerable personal cost, the difference between observing something from a safe distance and actually seeing it, the difference between a catalogue and a comprehension, between knowing the name of a thing and understanding what it is. On the days when the vine was particularly vigorous, reaching for the light with persistence that nothing in the universe had ever managed to breed out of it, he would sit back in his chair and feel something he had not expected to feel: gratitude. Not for the humiliation. Not for the 4 to 7 million views or the memes or the 2 weeks of jokes at his expense in every faculty lounge across the cooperative. Gratitude for the education. There was a difference, he had learned, between knowing something and understanding it. He had known about Earth biology for 12 years. He had understood it for approximately 4 to 5 minutes, and those 4 to 5 minutes had cost him a lab, his dignity, 3 ribs, and a dislocated shoulder. It had been worth every bit of it. Outside his window, the former Bolaf 7 wore its kudzu in all weathers, green and gold and rust with the turning of the seasons, patient and entirely unconcerned with what anyone thought of it. Somewhere in the depths of the ventilation system, the cockroaches were doing whatever cockroaches do when left unsupervised on an alien world, exploring, adapting, thriving in circumstances that had never been designed with them in mind and had consequently not managed to stop them. In the hazmat unit, the ants were building, always building, with a cheerful industry of organisms that had never once in 100 million years encountered a problem they were willing to call permanent. In the soil of the windowsill terrarium, the kudzu reached for the light. It always did. Never underestimate a death world. They didn't earn that classification by accident. They earned it through 4 billion years of trying, failing, adapting, and trying again. Through organisms that looked at extinction and said, "Not yet, not today, not ever." Earth biology was not primitive. It was battle-tested. It was not simple. It was ruthlessly efficient. It was not weak. It was proven. And the universe, in its patient and indifferent way, will always find a method of demonstrating this to anyone arrogant enough to require the lesson. The only question it ever asks in return is whether you're paying attention. Professor Velcranthos Thoss, 17 degrees, one's enterprise, and a windowsill full of kudzu, had learned, finally and completely, to pay attention. It was, he would tell his students every cycle, the only degree that actually mattered. Professor Velcranthos Thoss held, in his own thoroughly biased and carefully cultivated opinion, the undisputed title of the finest xenobiologist in the entire Galactic Academic Institute. This was not mere vanity, or rather, it was exactly mere vanity, but he had decorated it so thoroughly with credentials, awards, and published papers that it had begun to resemble something like fact. He possessed 17 advanced degrees for cybernetic memory implants custom-tuned to his species' unique neural architecture, and an ego so vast it arguably exerted its own gravitational pull on the objects around him. Junior faculty had learned to lean slightly away when he walked past. Whether this was metaphorical or literal remained a matter of quiet debate in the faculty lounge. Every third cycle, Velcranthos strode into lecture hall via 9 as though he had personally commissioned a construction, which he had not, but no one bothered to correct him. Tenure at the Galactic Academic Institute was not merely job protection. It was more permanent than the event horizon of a singularity. Attempting to dislodge a tenured professor was an exercise in institutional futility, and everyone had tacitly agreed that it was far easier to simply let Velcranthos be Velcranthos. He was magnificent at it. After all, students. His voice rang out one morning, 3 vocal cord harmonizing in a chord he privately considered inspiring and his students privately considered insufferable. His iridescent blue scales shimmered beneath the bioluminescent ceiling panels, a proud, saturated blue that seemed to broadcast a single message to every being in the room. I am better than you, and we both already know it. He tapped his data slate with one long, six-fingered hand, and a holographic display erupted behind him in a cascade of rotating imagery. Today we continue our fascinating series on failed evolutionary experiments from Category 9 Death Worlds. The assembled students, 73 beings representing 42 distinct species from across the cooperative, adjusted in their seats with a collective murmur. Some leaned forward with genuine excitement. Others sank back with dread. Most wore the resigned expression of beings who had checked the course withdrawal deadline and discovered it had passed 3 cycles ago. Velcranthos' true passion, you see, was not xenobiology in the broad academic sense. That would have been too modest, too pedestrian for a mind of his caliber. No, his singular obsession was a cataloging, classification, and enthusiastic mockery of the evolutionary disasters that had, against all reasonable statistical probability, managed to not only survive but thrive on the most hostile planets in known space. He kept specimens, dozens of them in his office alone, arranged like trophies. Hundreds more if you counted the frozen samples in Sublevel Storage Unit 42, which his research assistant, Trill, kept begging him never to open. Containment protocols, she would say. Safety regulations. Cross-contamination risks. Boring word from a boring mind, he had always thought. The universe did not build its wonders behind safety seals. His office had become something of a legend among graduate students. Preserved creatures floated in suspension tanks along every wall, the alien physiologists captured mid-motion for eternity. Crystallized spore samples from worlds where the atmosphere could dissolve starship hull plating sat in labeled jars beside a rather alarming collection he called his adorably lethal organisms, things that had evolved on planets with gravity 3 times the galactic standard, and which looked perfectly harmless until you read the small print about what they did to biological matter under pressure. He loved showcasing them at faculty mixers, watching colleagues go pale when he casually handed them a jar containing something that could theoretically dissolve reinforced titanium if it ever warmed past stasis temperature. Nothing said intellectual superiority quite like weaponized biology on a cocktail table. Then came Cycle 47 of the academic year, the day 3 humans walked into his lecture hall and changed everything. They arrived as part of an exchange program, the Galactic Cooperative's tentative diplomatic gesture toward Earth, a Class 9 death world orbiting an unremarkable star in the outer Sol system. Earth had been granted provisional membership after its inhabitants had achieved faster-than-light travel, which they had accomplished by, and is still deeply unsettled the Galactic Transit Authority, strapping themselves to barely controlled explosions and pointing themselves at the void. Velcranthos had watched their orientation footage 3 times, each viewing deepening his professional contempt. The initial application documents had been submitted by creatures who, upon discovering that the physics of interstellar travel required speeds that conventional engines couldn't achieve, had responded by building bigger, more unstable engines and riding them anyway. The Transit Authority's review board had spent 6 weeks debating whether this qualified as advanced technology or elaborate suicide. In the end, it qualified as both, and Earth was admitted. The humans assigned to the Galactic Academic Institute were 3 in number, their names listed on his course roster in the blunt, 2-syllable style their species seemed to favor: Marcus Webb, Rita Torres, and Jack Chen. Velcranthos had looked them up before their first class, reviewing their biological profiles with the gleeful anticipation of a collector examining a particularly rare specimen of evolutionary failure. Bipedal. Single heart, no exoskeleton, no natural armor plating, no venom glands, no redundant organ systems. Their skeletal structure was calcium-based and relatively brittle. Their skin, their largest organ, which was already saying something, was thin enough to puncture with moderate pressure. They were not particularly fast compared to most predator species. They were not particularly strong compared to most prey species. They possessed no natural weapons of any consequence, no claws worth mentioning, no venom, no electromagnetic discharge, no chemical deterrence. What they did have was a large brain relative to their body size, forward-facing eyes designed for depth perception, and an almost aggressive tendency to use tools to compensate for every biological inadequacy that evolution had saddled them with. They were, in Velcranthos' considered professional opinion, a cosmic punchline. He spotted them the moment they entered his lecture hall for the first time. 3 smooth-skinned, oddly symmetrical beings in the middle rows, wrapped in their characteristic excessive clothing despite the perfectly regulated interior temperature. They looked around with the careful attentiveness of creatures that had survived by paying close attention to unfamiliar environments, a habit Velcranthos noted without fully appreciating its implications.